One of the most unsettling discoveries a person can make is realizing that evil rarely introduces itself as evil. It almost always arrives wearing the language of admiration, affection, intelligence, charisma, or even apparent virtue. This is why encounters with narcissistic people are so spiritually disorienting. The pain is not only in what they did to you, the deeper pain is in discovering how thoroughly appearances can deceive the human mind. And perhaps this is the first prophetic lesson hidden inside the experience. God was not merely removing a harmful person from your life. He was removing an illusion from your understanding of reality itself. Most people move through life assuming sincerity, where there is confidence, goodness where there is charm, and depth where there is emotional intensity. We are naturally drawn toward people who seem certain of themselves. Human beings often mistake strength of personality for strength of character, but they are not the same thing. A person can possess enormous social power and yet remain morally hollow. In fact, some of the most destructive personalities survive precisely because they understand how to imitate the outward signs of trait without ever possessing its substance. That realization changes you forever. Before this awakening, many people unconsciously live dependent upon appearances. They trust words too quickly. They confuse being desired with being valued. They assume that attention equals love. But narcissistic individuals force you into a brutal education about human nature. They teach, often painfully, that admiration can conceal exploitation, that affection can become control, and that flattery can be used as a weapon more effectively than hostility. And once you see this clearly, you can never entirely return to the innocence you once had. Yet this is where the spiritual dimension begins to emerge. Because God often awakens people through disruption, not comfort. Truth rarely enters our lives gently. Most transformations begin with the collapse of false certainty. The narcissist becomes, strangely enough, the instrument through which hidden blindness is exposed, not because God approves of cruelty, but because he can force even darkness to reveal truth. The betrayal uncovers your vulnerabilities. The manipulation exposes your hunger for approval. The emotional confusion reveals how easily AR can override discernment, and suddenly the experience becomes larger than one toxic relationship. It becomes an unveiling of the human condition itself. You begin to notice something profound. Deception only works when it finds something inside us willing to believe the illusion. That is a difficult truth, but also a liberating one, because once you understand this, you stop living as a passive victim of other people's behavior and begin examining the deeper structures of your own soul. Why was charm so persuasive to you? Why did you ignore your intuition? Why did performance impress you more than consistency? Why did you continue explaining away what your spirit already recognized? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are sacred questions, and this is why the awakening feels prophetic. A prophet, in the deepest sense, is not merely someone who predicts events. A prophet is someone whose eyes have been opened to reality beneath appearances. Someone who can no longer be hypnotized by surfaces. Someone who sees what others ignore. The experience with narcissism often creates exactly this transformation. You stop worshipping image. You stop confusing visibility with virtue. You stop assuming that confidence equals wisdom. Discernment begins replacing naivete. That change affects every part of life. You become slower to idolize people. Slower to surrender your identity for acceptance. Slower to trust words unsupported by action. And contrary to what some believe, this does not make a person cold. Properly understood, it makes a person awake. There is a difference between cynicism and discernment. Cynicism believes goodness does not exist. Discernment simply refuses to confuse goodness with performance. And perhaps that is one of the greatest spiritual dangers of our age. Humanity has become hypnotized by appearances. We live in a world that rewards presentation more than integrity, visibility more than wisdom, influence more than character. Narcissistic personalities thrive in such environments because they understand the power of image. But God, in His severe mercy, sometimes allows painful encounters to free us from slavery to illusion. Not to destroy our ability to love, but to purify it. Not to make us fearful of people, but truthful about them. Not to harden the heart, but to open the eyes. And once your eyes are opened, you carry a responsibility. Because awakening is not meant to end in bitterness. It is meant to mature into wisdom. The lesson was never simply, be careful who you trust. The deeper lesson is, learn to value truth above appearance in every dimension of life. Because the moment you stop worshipping illusion is the moment you finally become free. One of the most destructive effects of narcissistic environments is not merely emotional pain, but the gradual erosion of a person's trust in their own perception. That is how manipulation gains power. It does not always begin with open cruelty. More often, it begins subtly, almost invisibly, through contradiction, confusion, guilt, and emotional distortion repeated over time, until the individual no longer feels entitled to trust what they see, think, or feel. The tragedy is that many people do not even realize this is happening, while it is happening. They only recognize it afterward, when they look back and wonder how they became disconnected from themselves. And this is precisely where the deeper transformation begins, because the prophetic reason behind the struggle was not only to reveal deception in others, but to awaken authority within you. Number, domination over others, but mastery over your own mind, conscience, and discernment. Many people enter these relationships spiritually uncertain, emotionally dependent, and psychologically vulnerable to external validation. They seek peace by pleasing others. They avoid conflict at the cost of truth. They silence intuition in order to preserve acceptance. In many ways, they have been conditioned to distrust themselves long before the narcissist ever arrived. The narcissistic personality simply exploits that weakness. This is why the experience often feels so psychologically exhausting. You are not merely fighting another person's behavior. You are fighting a constant assault against your inner clarity. The manipulator survives by making you second-guess reality itself. They rewrite conversations, deny obvious behavior, shift blame, distort motives, and create emotional instability until confusion becomes normal. Over time, the victim begins relying on the manipulator to define reality for them. And once a human being loses confidence in their own perception, they become remarkably easy to control. But there comes a moment in awakening when something begins to resist, quietly. At first, a feeling that certain things are no longer acceptable, a realization that your exhaustion is not weakness, but evidence of prolonged psychological conflict. You begin noticing patterns instead of isolated incidents. The fog starts lifting. And perhaps for the first time in years you stop asking, "How do I keep this person happy?" and begin asking, "Why have I abandoned myself to maintain someone else's comfort?" That question changes everything. Because true spiritual maturity begins when a person stops negotiating against their own conscience. There is something sacred about reclaiming the ability to trust your own perception again. Not blindly, not arrogantly, but honestly. Discernment is not suspicion of everyone. Discernment is alignment between what you observe internally and what you permit externally. It is the refusal to betray your own soul for temporary approval. And this is where many people misunderstand strength. Strength is not aggression. It is not emotional hardness. It is not becoming cruel because someone was cruel to you. Real strength is the ability to remain truthful under pressure. It is the courage to hold on to reality when manipulation demands that you surrender it. The narcissistic environment, painful as it is, often becomes the furnace where this kind of inner authority is forged, because eventually you discover something liberating. Guilt is not always evidence of wrongdoing. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional reaction that occurs when a conditioned person begins setting healthy boundaries. That realization shocks many people. They have spent years believing that discomfort means they are doing something wrong, but growth is uncomfortable precisely because it breaks unhealthy conditioning. The narcissist depends upon your fear of disappointing others. God, however, begins teaching you the difference between kindness and self-erasure. And once that distinction becomes clear, your entire posture toward life changes. You stop over-explaining your boundaries. You stop apologizing for needing peace. You stop treating your intuition like an enemy. You become more observant, more grounded, less emotionally hypnotized by charisma or intimidation. You learn that not every accusation deserves defense. Not every conflict deserves engagement, and not every emotional reaction from others is your responsibility to manage. This is not selfishness, it is clarity. In many ways, narcissistic abuse creates the conditions for a profound spiritual confrontation. Will you continue abandoning your own inner truth in order to maintain external harmony, or will you finally stand in reality, even if it disappoints people? That is not merely a psychological question. It is a moral one. Because every human being eventually serves something: approval, fear, image, comfort, or truth. And perhaps the greatest awakening of all is realizing that peace does not come from controlling how others perceive you. Peace comes from no longer needing to betray yourself to survive. That is the authority God was building in you all along. The moment you stop surrendering your conscience for acceptance is the moment manipulation loses its power over your life. There is a strange transformation that often happens after a person has endured deep psychological manipulation and survived it with their soul still intact. They begin noticing pain in others that previously would have escaped their attention, not because they have become suspicious of humanity, but because suffering has sharpened their perception. They recognize the exhaustion behind forced smiles. They hear fear hidden beneath rehearsed explanations. They notice hesitation, emotional confusion, chronic self-doubt, and the quiet language of people who have been taught to disappear inside relationships. What once seemed invisible now becomes unmistakably clear, and this is where suffering begins to change its meaning. Because one of the prophetic reasons God allows certain people to walk through narcissistic environments is that pain can produce a form of wisdom that comfort rarely creates. There are truths about human nature that cannot be fully understood academically. They must be lived. A person who has never experienced manipulation may understand the concept intellectually, but they often cannot grasp the spiritual weight of it. They do not know what it feels like to question their own memory, suppress their own intuition, or slowly lose confidence in their own identity while appearing functional to the outside world. But those who have endured it know, and because they know, they carry something valuable into the world: recognition. That recognition matters more than most people realize. One of the cruel aspects of narcissistic abuse is isolation. The victim often feels trapped inside an experience they cannot fully explain. The manipulation is subtle enough to evade easy description. Outsiders may see only fragments, occasional arguments, emotional sensitivity, relational tension, while missing the invisible psychological warfare occurring beneath the surface. This creates profound loneliness. The wounded person begins doubting not only themselves, but whether anyone will ever truly understand what they are enduring. Then suddenly they encounter someone who does understand, someone who recognizes the patterns immediately, someone who does not dismiss their confusion, someone who can calmly name the manipulation without minimizing the damage. In many cases, that moment becomes the beginning of healing, not because all the pain instantly disappears, but because clarity breaks isolation. Human beings can endure enormous suffering when truth accompanies them. What destroys the soul is often not pain itself, but confusion without meaning. This is why your survival may carry a responsibility larger than your own recovery. Because people who have walked through darkness and remained honest become uniquely capable of guiding others through it. Not with superiority, not with self-righteousness, but with earned wisdom. There is an authority that comes from experience honestly examined. And unlike shallow advice, this kind of wisdom carries weight because it has been tested against reality. Yet there is an important distinction here. Suffering alone does not automatically produce wisdom. Some people suffer and become bitter, cynical, consumed by vengeance. Pain can deepen a soul, but it can also deform one. The transformation only becomes prophetic when suffering is purified into understanding rather than hatred. That is the difficult task. Because after being wounded, the temptation is to harden completely, to distrust everyone, to interpret all human weakness as malice. But wisdom requires something more disciplined than bitterness. It requires the ability to see clearly without surrendering compassion. That balance is rare, and perhaps that is why people who have genuinely healed often become a refuge for others. They no longer speak in simplistic language. They understand complexity. They know why intelligent people remain in destructive relationships. They understand trauma bond, emotional dependency, fear, shame, and spiritual confusion. They know that healing is rarely linear, and that freedom often arrives gradually, through painful stages of awakening. More importantly, they stop speaking to wounded people with condemnation, because they remember what confusion felt like. This changes the way they move through the world. Conversations become more attentive. Their discernment sharpens. They become less impressed by outward performance and more concerned with hidden integrity. Often they begin protecting others instinctively, noticing controlling dynamics before they fully develop. What once wounded them now becomes part of their ability to serve, guide, and strengthen others. And perhaps this reveals something profound about the nature of redemption itself. God does not merely rescue people from suffering, He transforms suffering into usefulness. The wound becomes a source of vision. The scar becomes evidence that survival is possible. The person who once felt powerless becomes capable of helping others reclaim their dignity. That is why your story matters, even when it feels painful to remember. Not because suffering itself is holy, but because truth carried through suffering acquires extraordinary power. People listen differently when they sense authenticity. They trust voices that have endured reality rather than merely studied it from a distance. And in a world filled with performance, image, and superficial advice, authentic wisdom becomes profoundly rare. So perhaps the question is no longer, why did this happen to me? Perhaps the deeper question is, what kind of person will this suffering allow me to become? Because sometimes the very battle that nearly destroyed you becomes the reason someone else finally escapes the darkness. At the deepest level, the encounter with narcissism is not merely relational or psychological. It is spiritual. Long after the arguments end, long after the manipulation is recognized, long after physical distance has been created, many people discover that the greatest battle was never simply against another person. The real battle was over identity, truth, and the condition of the soul itself. Because narcissistic environments force human beings into questions they would otherwise spend years avoiding. Who am I when approval is removed? Why do I feel responsible for saving people who continually harm me? Why am I so afraid to disappoint others, even at the cost of destroying my own peace? What is love, truly? Is it sacrifice without limits, endless tolerance, emotional dependence, or is real love inseparable from truth, dignity, and freedom? These are not shallow questions, they are existential questions, and often it takes suffering to drag them into the light. Most people begin life building identity outwardly rather than inwardly. They construct themselves through acceptance, validation, status, relationships, appearance, or usefulness to others. In many ways, society encourages this. We are taught to measure ourselves through external responses. If people admire us, we feel valuable. If people reject us, we question our worth. This creates a fragile identity because anything built entirely upon external affirmation can be manipulated by external forces, and narcissistic personalities instinctively exploit this fragility. They survive by controlling perception, approval, emotional reward, and emotional punishment. They understand that people who lack rooted identity can often be controlled through fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, or fear of death. Is approval. That is why narcissistic relationships frequently become spiritually consuming. The individual slowly loses connection with their own center. They become reactive rather than grounded. Their emotional world begins revolving around another person's moods, demands, or validation. And eventually exhaustion sets in. Not merely physical exhaustion, but existential exhaustion. The soul becomes tired of pretending, tired of explaining away contradictions, tired of shrinking itself to preserve unstable peace. Tired of performing emotional labor for relationships that never become emotionally safe. And strangely enough, this collapse often becomes the beginning of awakening, because there comes a moment when the human spirit can no longer survive divided against itself. A person reaches the limit of self-betrayal. They realize they have spent years trying to earn what should never require earning in the first place. Basic dignity, honesty, reciprocity, and peace. And in that realization, something begins rebuilding from the inside outward. This is where God often does his deepest work, not in comfort, but in confrontation, not by strengthening illusion, but by dismantling it. The false self begins dying, the version of you addicted to approval, terrified of rejection, dependent upon external affirmation for identity. And though that process feels painful, it is profoundly liberating, because a person cannot become spiritually whole while living entirely through the opinions, demands, and emotional control of others. The narcissistic relationship exposes this dependence with brutal clarity. It reveals how easily fear can govern decisions, how often people silence truth to preserve attachment, how frequently they tolerate emotional starvation simply because loneliness feels frightening. But once this pattern becomes visible, transformation becomes possible. The individual begins seeking something deeper than validation. They begin seeking truth itself, and truth changes a person fundamentally. Truth teaches you that peace is more valuable than performance, that boundaries are not cruelty, that discernment is not hatred, that love without truth becomes self-destruction. Slowly, identity becomes less dependent upon human approval and more rooted in inner conviction. The person who once feared being misunderstood becomes willing to stand alone if necessary, not because they stop loving others, but because they stop abandoning themselves in order to be loved. That shift is spiritual maturity, And perhaps this is why many people emerge from these experiences with an entirely different understanding of life. Their priorities change, surface-level relationships lose their appeal. They become more reflective, more intentional, less hypnotized by charm and status. They stop chasing environments that reward performance while starving the soul. Something inside them becomes quieter but stronger, not arrogant, not hardened, just awake. And maybe that awakening was the prophetic purpose all along. Because sometimes God allows certain illusions to collapse so that a person can finally discover who they are beneath them. The relationship breaks, but something truer begins forming in its place. The dependency weakens, the fear loosens, the endless need for external validation starts dying, and for the first time, the individual begins building a life rooted not in emotional survival, but in truth. That is the hidden redemption inside the suffering. You thought the battle was about losing another person, when in reality, it was about recovering yourself. And the moment a human being values truth more than approval is the moment their soul finally begins to walk in freedom.